Sherry.
How are you? Hi, I'm here with Dan.
Hi, Dan. Hey, I'm good. How about yourself?
Other than the overall picture, pretty well.
You're still upright?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
It could be worse.
Yeah, of course, yes.
Nice to meet you here.
Likewise.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
doing this. And I'm calling a couple minutes early because I wanted to make sure we got the technical stuff worked out, and was wondering if you're able to record on your end with the method that I had suggested, using an iPhone as the recorder, or if you have another device to record.
We're recording. By that means right now using a Rode mic and an iPod or an iPhone. I'm not sure which it is. Pauline does this, so I defer to her.
Okay, I just got when I got the message from Pauline that the number I'm calling is an iPhone. I just wanted to make sure that it's not the same iPhone that we're recording.
No.
Actually, it does. Okay, perfect.
Nope, it's not. She's sitting 3 feet away, recording on a separate device.
Hi, Pauline.
Hi, how are you?
Sherry and I are about 3 feet away here.
Okay. As long as we keep our safe spaces, we'll be fine.
And so I'm the news director at a public radio station in Northern California, where I still work. But,
Mendocino.
At the moment. Yes, Mendocino County. Do you know the area?
A little bit. I've been there many times. I took my first sabbatical leave from the University of Arizona at UC Berkeley.
Okay.
Spent a little time roaming around up there, and then for the next probably 5 years, maybe 10, my wife and I went to that area pretty regularly.
Yeah, it's quite a beautiful area.
Yeah, it's a nice escape from Tucson in the summertime, also.
Yeah, imagine. Well, if it's okay, we'll get started. And are you recording on your end?
Yes, we are recording. We are recording on this end. We did a sound check. All is well.
Okay, fantastic.
And where did you say you were calling from? I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Well, I'm in Salt Lake City with Dan here, but my job is still in Northern California at Mendocino Public Broadcasting, AGYX.
Okay.
Mendocino Public Radio.
Got it.
And so the goal with this, I mean, there's multiple ones, and the first one is to put an hour program on the public radio station there, and from this, and then also to post this on perhaps with photographs on YouTube, and then also I have other outlets for public radio, a PRX. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but to post it there, and then then it becomes available to stations all over the world.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and then they decide if they want to pick it up or not, and it usually goes pretty well. So,
sure.
So those are the goals right now.
Okay, and I will when Pauline sends you the audio file, she will also send several pictures.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Okay.
Of me doing various things.
Great. Okay. I'd like to put a slideshow together with it.
And then we were talking about stop recording after 30 minutes, just so you have a 30-minute file. It's easier to send to Sherry later in 30 minutes. Trying to break it up.
Yeah, I'm sure Pauline might be familiar with this, but I found that if I usually do this with folks who have no experience doing this, and then if they send me if we do the interview and it's over half an hour, 30 minutes, and they email it to me, they get stuck because it's too long to email past generally about an hour, and they have to cut it up in chunks. And I just find it easier to stop at half an hour and then start a whole new file, and then it sends in the email, no problem. Would that be okay?
Yeah, and do you do Dropbox?
I do have Dropbox. Which then, in that case, it probably doesn't need to be stopped.
Right.
It
Right.
should be fine as one whole file. So
Yeah,
if you want to do that, I think we can do that. No problem.
Yeah, Pauline says that would be best. She does
Okay.
Dropbox with 1 hour files regularly, so it's no big deal.
Okay, great.
Very good.
All right. Well, I will get started. And actually, so I can have this tape, could you state your name and whichever title you would like to use?
Sure. Guy McPherson, Professor Emeritus of Conservation Biology at the University of Arizona.
Okay. And I always love to know first people's backgrounds, and I'm wondering can you discuss why you chose conservation biology, and did your childhood have any impact on that?
It's interesting. I didn't really choose conservation biology. Conservation biology chose me. My upbringing almost certainly had something to do with that. I was raised in northern Idaho. I was the middle of 3 children, and my parents were enormous outdoors people. So we spent almost every day after school and on weekends hunting and fishing. And I know that's not the vegan proper way of saying it, but I ate almost no meat when I was a kid growing up that wasn't wild, that wasn't something that we caught or shot in the family. We couldn't afford beef at the grocery store. It was just way too expensive for people, for a 5-member family with one income, and that was my dad. He was a school teacher, public school teacher, and then he became a public school principal and then ultimately a superintendent, and he retired from that position. And so what that meant was it gave us quite a bit of time in the summers to go camping and fishing. And my dad was an avid outdoorsman. So pretty much every day after school in the fall, he would drag us out hunting for grouse or pheasant or quail or whatever was in season at the time, including deer and elk. So I became very well acquainted with the outdoors. I grew up in a small town of about 700 people in northern Idaho, and it was the 1960s and early 1970s. In those days,
what's the name of
the name of the town I grew up in was Weippe, 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 Idaho. It's known only if you've seen and can remember Ken Burns' documentary film, Core of Discovery. And it's known only because the Weippe Prairie is mentioned as the place that Lewis and Clark in this Core of Discovery first met the Nez Perce Indians. And the little town of Weippe grew up on this prairie. And when I was there in the 60s and early 70s, it was a logging town for the most part. They were in the midst of cutting down every last tree in northern and central Idaho.
Potlatch Corporation?
Yes, Potlatch Corporation was huge there. And in fact, my first or second girlfriend was in Headquarters, Idaho. It was called Headquarters because it was a company town, the likes of which you don't see much anymore. It was a town in which every home and every business, every single structure was owned by Potlatch Timber Company. So it was called Headquarters because it was. It was the headquarters for the logging operations. So there were 3 large sawmills in Weippe, Idaho, population 713, according to the signs on either side of town. And really it was a little village in the middle of a forest and a prairie with streams running through. So I misspent most of my youth playing with other little kids outside. And we were free-range children because that's the way it happened back then.
I call that a good use. Did you happen to see the movie Smoke Signals?
Oh, yes.
Indian tribe, somewhere in northern Idaho. It's quite entertaining. I watched it 2 or 3 times. But,
I think
I know where Coeur d'Alene is.
Yeah, I think I have seen it a time or two. I was actually born near Coeur d'Alene in Wallace, Idaho,
Okay.
the Silver Valley. But then
Yep.
my dad took a principalship when I was about to enter first grade in Weippe, and it's a ways south. It's what the locals call Clearwater country. It's along the Clearwater River, and really the home to some big timber, and that's what kept it going. Interesting, when I visited about a year and a half ago, the population is down well below 500 now. And whereas when I was a kid going to school, we had 40 or 50 kids in every grade in elementary school because it was the end of the age expansion. Now there's maybe now maybe there's 100 or 150 people in the K through 12 school that is actually consolidated with Pierce, a town a few miles away. And when I was a kid there, that was our big rivalry. It was the Weippe Pierce rivalry, and there was lots and lots of kids because there was lots of industry. That's all pretty much gone now.
Yeah. One of the big concerns I had, I think I might have mentioned I taught elementary school for 25 years. I was a few breaks here and there. But I grew up on Long Island, 30 miles out of New York City. And as I was growing up, I was born in 1947, I saw Long Island, or New York, spilling over onto Long Island, wiping out the fields, the woods, the streams, the ponds where I used to play. So I was an early environmentalist without even knowing the term.
Right.
And teaching school in Salt Lake City and also in Southern Idaho, Shelley, Idaho, the kids don't have those places to play anymore. They don't relate to nature. I've tried to do what hikes I can, not that it's 2 a year here and there. But even that, in Salt Lake, there are more and more developments going up. And ironically, the kids just love the hikes. They eat them up with their magnifying glasses. That's no longer a common phenomenon.
Right, of course. Almost everybody now has nature deficit disorder. Almost nobody gets to go out and play in the woods. And of course, when you let a kid go play in the woods and poking their fingers in the dirt and in the holes in the trees and pull the pitch off and get all filthy and eat the bugs, of course they love that. That's who we are. We're not evolutionarily, we're not really very far from everybody doing that all the time.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm just interjecting here. This just reminds me of about, I don't know, 11 years ago. 10 years ago, I spent some time in the rainforest in Paraguay with some hunter-gatherers, Viache, and for a story. And what I learned was that, they were one of the last tribes to be introduced to Western society. And the anthropologist told me that they didn't have depression before before introduction and coming out of the forest, out in villages.
Yeah, of course.
There's a lot of studies that show that depression, nature can help cure depression, and so it's in all of us.
Right, and in fact, my first book-length work of social criticism was a text called "Killing the Natives: Has the American Dream Become a Nightmare?" It was published in 2004, 2005, and I wrote quite a bit about that, about the way the American dream, as we currently interpret it, is destroying languages and cultures and people, and of course, several hundred species every day. So it's utterly disastrous, of course, and it's only gotten worse since that book came out more than a dozen years ago.
That leads me to one topic is capitalism. Of course, a pretty big topic, and that has commodified everything. I mean, literally just everything. What isn't yet is about to be. And what astounds me when I think about it, I've read tons of books on the economy over the past 50 years or so, and articles and whatnot, and these guys just don't seem to have any basis in reality, any grounding in laws of physics or biology or chemistry or anything. I find that astounding. And then parallel to that, I look around and we are the only species that uses money. Everyone else gets along fine. They've got their own economics, but there's no money involved.
Right. And that's a relatively recent phenomenon as well. You know, humans have been here. Homo sapiens, our species, has been here for 300,000 years or so, and money arose really just a few thousand years ago, according to David Graeber's book. Debt, I think it's the subtitle is the first 5,000 years, and other people argue it's 6,000, maybe it's 7,000. But in any event, it's a relatively new phenomenon. The idea of having some sort of currency to substitute for what we always used before.
Yeah. It seems inevitable that there must be some sort of unit of measure for economic exchange is one of the definitions of money. Just because some of the things come from somebody, I'm in a house in suburbia, and, things here come from all over the world, literally,
Right.
The mails and everything. So, I don't know the solution, but I was going to ask you about, I think a couple of the changes in our legislature, supposedly. I doubt this to be too much myself, but what is your take on these people, Alexandria, Octavio Cortez, and then I know you were talking to the Extinction Rebellion people not too long ago.
Right.
Given everything else you've said and so many others have said, it seems so pointless. It seems like they're wasting their time on one level. You could argue it gives hope, but then it's a false hope. It seems
right. And I interviewed one of the people who's pretty intimately involved with the group, a guy who's been an organic farmer in Wales for many years, and last I heard he was looking for a place to live in London because he was spending so much of his time there with the XR movement. And we interviewed him for the radio show on our last episode. And
I heard that. It was very, very well done, by the way.
Okay. Well, thank you. And, Roger Hallam, sort of argued for rebellion for its own sake. And even if, sort of going along with the Buddhist philosophy of taking right action and not being attached to the outcome. And that's the only way XR makes any sense to me, personally. Because, I thought we've been over the cliff for, I've been talking about this for more than a decade, and with a very short timeline for 6 years or so. And Dar Jamail's latest interview was released not very long ago, just a couple of days ago, maybe a week ago, and the title of it is "We Are Over the Cliff." And so here's a renowned journalist who has been tracking this since he discovered my work in 2012, I believe, and turned his life upside down to start reporting on this story instead of on the U.S. misadventures in the Middle East and Northern Africa. And he gets it. He gets it that, we are over the cliff. And I don't see any way of reversing abrupt, irreversible climate change. And so, on the one hand, yes, I think that we are too late and it's a, quote, waste of time. But pointing out the disaster that capitalism and industrial civilization itself have become maybe is justifiable in its own right. And maybe this is the way to get the word out that we are in the midst of an irreparable climate emergency. Maybe this is the way to do that. I've been almost completely unsuccessful in my own attempts to bring attention to the idea that we're going to be extinct soon. So maybe this is one way to go.
Could you just describe that turning point for you when you yourself came to the conclusion that humans will be extinct within, I mean, and if you could say when you think that is, I believe I've read and seen some of your thoughts on that, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate here. And when you came to that, like maybe the process, and maybe it wasn't just all of a sudden, over a period of years, weeks, or months.
Right. So it's 2002. I was editing a book on climate change with a colleague of mine, and it focused, unlike previous books that dealt with climate change and ecosystems, this book focused on and focuses on precipitation as a major product of climate change, shifts in precipitation patterns around the world, and consequent effects on ecosystems and how that's going to influence primary productivity and everything that really matters for the human existence. So that was 2002, and as a consequence of looking at all the evidence, looking at these compilations of work on geomorphology and soil science and soil plant water relations and precipitation manipulations at the time, there were 4 studies published or ongoing that dealt with directly manipulating precipitation regime and studying the consequences for ecosystems. So this is 2002. The book came out in 2003, and I realized gradually over time in the course of compiling and reviewing and editing all of these disparate chapters, I realized that we're done, and it's probably by 2030. A couple of years later, a year or 2 later, I couldn't remember exactly when it was, I discovered the idea of global peak oil or net energy decline. And it occurred to me that this is it. This is the Hail Mary pass. This is going to shut off the heat engine that is civilization. And as a consequence of that, we're safe. We might get a few more generations out of it. It's not going to be 2030 after all. It's going to be sometime in the future. And then several years after that, in December of 2011, after I left active service at the university and established a homestead in the wilds of southern New Mexico, it was in December 2011 that the first paper in the referee journal literature came out that had to do with global dimming or the aerosol masking effect, and it was by James Hansen and colleagues. It indicated global average temperature rise from the absence of global dimming when civilization is turned off worldwide of 1.2 plus or minus 0.2 degrees Celsius. Well, that was pretty bad, but I realized that probably all of civilization was not going to be shut off at one time. And so probably we could get through that. And then the subsequent paper in early 2013 by Levy and colleagues finds that the aerosol masking effect is actually up to 1 degree C with as little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity. Oh my goodness, that is huge. To reduce industrial activity by 35%, the equivalent basically of China or Europe and a little more, or the United States and a little more, for that relatively small amount of reduction in industrial activity to cause enough aerosols to fall out of the atmosphere and thereby heat up the planet by 1 degree C is earth-shaking. Nothing short of earth-shaking. And you tack that 1 degree onto, we're now at the highest temperature that Homo sapiens have experienced on Earth. You tack that on in a short period of time, and this is important. The rate is what really matters here. And as a conservation biologist studying non-human species, you realize that the rate of change is hugely important, and of course it is for humans as well. So that's when I realized that it's hopeless, that I became hope-free. over the process of learning about and concluding we're all going to be extinct by 2030. That was in 2002. Then discovering global peak oil and thinking the heat engine is going to stop, and then realizing that when the heat engine stops, the temperature goes up even faster, paradoxically. And so that transpired over a course of, what is that, 11 years. So a relatively gradual period of time.
And are you still thinking 2030? I've read some that, 2019. I'm just wondering, curious where you're at now.
I think by 2026, and I've been saying that for a couple of years now, and this is based on an analysis by Sam Carana, and we can talk about who or what that is, Sam Carana.
Sure.
And he did this analysis July 15th, I think it was, 2016. I was driving to Belize from New Mexico at the time, so I didn't discover it for a couple of weeks. And when I did, I took a more conservative approach than he did in projecting the contribution of various factors that are contributing and will continue to contribute to global average temperature rise. And he came up with a little more than 10 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline by the middle of 2026. And I came up with plus at least 8.7 degrees above the 1750 baseline by that same point of time, taking a very conservative approach. And given the rate of change, even if it's half that, even if it's 4, even if it's 3, we're probably going to be extinct as a result, because the natural world just cannot keep up with that rate of change, including human beings that depend upon the natural world for our very survival in the form of potable water and healthy food and so on. So I'm back to 2026. By 2026, which is not far from what I said in 2011, which seems like a really long time ago now.
Yeah. One of the things, I've heard you mention those figures many times, and I'm wondering how accurate you appear to put a good deal of confidence in those studies. Like, if we're down 35% of industrial, whatever we're doing, there's got to be a lot of numbers involved in there, a lot of assumptions too, I would assume.
Yes, and I keep in mind that the referee journal literature is perhaps the most conservative source of information in the history of the planet.
Yes.
So, I mean, you look at all of the contributors over the course of the next 10 years that Sam Carana evaluated, and they're all incredibly conservative. They're based upon this incredibly conservative process that produces amazingly conservative results. And you add all those up, and it still adds up to really high numbers. So, and also, and I've been keeping track for a long time of those self-reinforcing feedback loops, and it comprises thousands of words now in an essay on my blog, guymcpherson.com. And I stopped when I got to somewhere in the high 60s. I can't even remember, because it's been a couple of years. When I moved to Belize, I didn't have access to decent telecommunications infrastructure, and so I just stopped at a really high number of self-reinforcing feedback loops. And you look at the permafrost, the terrestrial permafrost. You look at the clathrate gun, or the hydrates pouring out of the Arctic Ocean, and either one of those is enough to warm the planet very abruptly in a short period of time, sufficiently to cause our extinction. And so I don't think you need to have 8.7 or 8 or 5 degrees global average temperature rise to cause our extinction in that short period of time. And of course, more recently, other people have been coming forward as well. Just a few days ago, there was the main opinion piece in the New York Times asks the question, would it be so bad if humans went extinct? And so the whole story is about if human extinction occurs in a relatively short period of time, would that be so bad? Might that be a good thing for the living planet? And I think it's important to point out that that paper misses or purposely avoids things like the catastrophic meltdown of the world's nuclear power plants when humans go extinct. So no, it's not going to be a good thing at all.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that now the New York Times is actually encouraging the conversation about human extinction when you consider that they were among the first corporate outlets to do a major hit piece on me when I rose to sufficient fame that people were starting to pay attention.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on population? Because that, it's all about climate change, but population is really maybe in large part.
It's a huge part. It's absolutely. It's been an absolutely huge part for a long time, and conservation biologists for at least 50 years have been pointing out the interaction between population and consumption. So the interaction, the multiplicative impact of an increased number of humans and their increased desires to consume the planet is what is going to drive us over the brink. Paul Ehrlich published a book on this topic in 1968 called The Population Bomb, and he wasn't the only one. Garrett Hardin was writing and speaking about it at the time as well. Garrett Hardin is famous for his Living on a Lifeboat and Tragedy of the Commons essays, and is also well known for asking the question, and then what? So he would always ask the question when somebody came up with a solution. The solution is to do this. Like, for example, he's dead now and has been for a long time, but I suspect he would ask the Extinction Rebellion folks, okay, so you managed to reduce emissions by 25% or 30% or whatever by a certain year, and then what? And of course, the and then what, when you know about global dimming or the aerosol masking effect, is we're all going to go extinct even faster.
Yeah, that seems to be a ever-missing question. Then what?
Right.
It drives me crazy. But,
yeah.
I just want to say one thing. One example. I feel like an example is Salt Lake City, or the Wasatch Front here. We have some of the worst air pollution in the world during several times of the year. And sorry, we got a call interrupting us. It's just. Hopefully, you don't hear that on your end.
Nope, I can't hear it.
But so the air pollution. There's a significant air pollution problem that they're working on. But the growth. We're having such a huge growth spurt right now that it's negating all of the work that they're doing for the pollution. And so I feel like that's just maybe one small example of a bigger picture of what's happening. Even if we do all of these, reduce all of these emissions and such, that the more people, it's just going to go back up again.
Of course. If you keep adding more people to a planet that is not growing in size, then no matter what else you do, it's not going to turn out well. And we've known this for more than 50 years. People have been...
Yeah, well, we go back to Thomas Malthus, I think. Pretty good
it's a really uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people to have, and societies to have, actually, and media. They don't really want to address it. For the most part, it's climate change.
Absolutely. And, there's several reasons for that. And nobody wants to get into the business of telling people they can't have children. That's as untouchable as hope in this society. You can't touch hope, and you can't touch people's right to have as many babies as they want for some reason. Garrett Hardin in the 1960s was writing solutions to the population problem, and so was Paul Ehrlich and his wife Anne, who, interestingly enough, her name wasn't allowed on that book, Population Bomb, because publishers thought that women don't know anything about controlling the human population.
I didn't realize that was
I mean, can you? And this is the kind of thing that today we just shake our heads, but in the 1960s, that was the conventional thought. That's how far we've come as a society, and also how far we've yet to come when you look at population as being a significant driver, and consumption. You know, if we all lived like the tribe you mentioned in Peru, if we all lived that way today, we would be having a relatively minor impact on the planet. On the other hand, if we all lived as the typical American does, we'd have run out of planet a long time ago. We'd have been extinct hundreds of years ago had we been living like Americans do for a long period of time. So that's an important element, the idea of consumption, along with human population. And I talked about this, you know, for 21 years in the classroom, and every one of my students went out and had babies. So, I mean, there's only so much one person can do in the face of societal pressure to have children. And, you know, the whole notion that you must live this one way. You go to school some more, you get married, you have 2.5 children, you work until you're 65, you retire, you enjoy your grandchildren, and blah, blah, blah. It's all this, everybody goes through the same story. We're all told the same story, and we come to believe that that's the way it's supposed to be. It's, in fact, the only way it could possibly be. And so, of course, here we are. How could we not be?
Just theoretically, if we could go to a relatively non-consumptive society, or theoretically, again, could recycle with a fusion reaction, distilling everything back to its virgin states, what do you suspect would be a sustainable population of humans?
Well, if we had the Earth we did before colonization took off, say before the 1400s, before people from Europe went floating all around the globe and enslaving and destroying everybody and everything in their path, the human population at that time was probably somewhere between 500 million and 1.5 billion. And so if we could go back to that kind of Earth, and we can't, but if we could, then maybe we could support 1 billion people. But we have fouled the Earth. It is not the Earth that it was in the 13 or 1400s. It's a completely different planet now. We have stripped the soil. All the topsoil in the breadbasket of North America has ended up in the Gulf of Mexico. Not all of it, but a huge proportion of it. We have sprayed with pesticides and with fertilizers, and we have destroyed the insects and the pollinators, the filter feeders. We have destroyed the old growth forest. You know, everything is so completely out of whack now that if we stop right now, never mind the aerosol masking effect, never mind that global dimming, if we just get rid of that completely, then I suspect we'd be headed for a planet with a few tens of thousands of people.
On that global dimming, another question: is it even conceivable that it could be industrial civilization or production could be tapered down slowly, and something else substituted for the aerosols?
Yeah, and a few things have been proposed, mostly by the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, headed by Sam Carana, and also by Peter Wadhams, the World Authority on Ice in the Arctic. Now, interestingly, the paper I mentioned earlier by Levy and colleagues, which came out in early 2013, they use the 100 degree, they use 2100 like every other climate science paper in the world does. And so they foresee the aerosol masking effect still being accountable for 1 degree, up to 1 degree Celsius, with as little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity, and that we will do that gradually between now and 2100. And still they come up with 1 degree. So it's absolutely huge. On the other hand, the Arctic Methane Emergency Group has been proposing marine cloud brightening and perhaps some other things. I don't keep track very closely, for at least 5 years. Now, that tells me the likelihood of something like that happening when they've been at it for 5 years or so, and nobody is paying attention. There's no government in the world. There's no corporation in the world. Apple probably has more money than the proverbial God, than all the governments of the world combined. And
Certainly Amazon.
right, Amazon, excellent. Jeff Bezos has the kind of money. He could throw money at, if money was going to fix it, or any particular strategy was going to fix it. The money is not lacking. Jeff Bezos wants to live for a long time, I guarantee it. Elon Musk wants to live for a long time, so much so that he's willing to go to Mars to do it, apparently. So I don't think money is the issue. I think that we haven't figured out anything viable in terms of replacing the aerosol masking effect.
Yeah. Yeah, I had run against Thorne and Hatch back in 2012. Of course, to no avail, but I had my name in again for federal senator from Utah this year as an independent, where I need names and signatures and whatever. And I was wavering back and forth for about 3 months, and I finally pulled my name out. And the reason was I have nothing to offer in terms of real hope. I could offer false hope, but that's just not what I do.
And the electorate is not really interested in a hope-free approach, I'm afraid.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yes, I clearly see that. You have mentioned habitat over and over, correctly, I think. But could you talk a little bit more about the parameters for, well, let's just say crops that we eat? I mean, I realize there's a whole lot more in terms of diversity, but in terms of temperature change, rain, drought, pH, whatever, you see as the main parameters for agricultural at the scale we now have, or close to it.
Yeah. Yeah, and this civilization, even though we call it industrial civilization, this civilization is dependent upon the production, storage, and distribution of grains at large scale, just like every other civilization so far to inhabit the earth. And so we really do depend upon the ability to grow corn and wheat, and not just because every ingredient label in the United States, for all practical purposes, has the words high fructose corn syrup on it. So, it's not just because we eat corn in everything we eat in this country. It's because that's how civilizations hold together, is with the ability to store grains in some capacity. Another way to put it, every civilization depends heavily upon bread and circuses. We're going to have circuses. I promise we're going to have circuses till the bitter end. But bread?
We are having them now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We got circus covered. But unless we have the wheat for the bread, we are not going to have the bread. And the bread is crucial to maintaining this set of living arrangements. You stop the ability, or even put a big dent in the ability to grow grains sufficient to produce bread to put on the shelves, then this set of living arrangements is in real trouble. And that I see as a major threat to civilization, because it doesn't take a lot of warming at the scale of the planet to preclude the ability to grow grains. And for a couple of reasons. One, it's a delicate balance already.
Yes.
Right. And so we've been growing wheat and corn in the places we've been growing wheat and corn. Just take the breadbasket of North America as one example. We've been growing the wheat and corn there for a long time because the soils are right, and the soil and the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, that's all right. And the temperature and the precipitation regime, it's all really just perfect. It's as if it was designed by some sort of designer for us to grow wheat and corn where we're growing wheat and corn. You couldn't ask for a better set of living conditions than that in terms of the soil and the precipitation regime. And by precipitation regime, I mean the amount and the distribution, when it falls and where it falls. It's the whole package. And if you mess with one part, you're not going to be able to grow what you currently are growing there. And all you have to do is look at 1,000 examples historically in the natural world and realize if you just change the temperature a little bit, or the fog drip one little bit, or the precipitation regime shifted a little to the summer instead of the winter, and on, or you remove a species that you didn't even know existed, some thing that is so small you can't even identify it, and then the whole ecosystem collapses.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So,
what about? Have you read anything about there's folks? I don't think I want to say UCL. I'm not sure. Somewhere down Southern California, and they were looking at splicing a gene into 4 major crops. I think I want to say corn, peas, and soy, and there's one other. And they said if these plants had this gene change, which presumably could be done quicker now with CRISPR technology, that it could take in CO2 at a very rapid rate. But it would be usable crops, but they'd be over about a fifth of the world's present agriculture. Have you heard about that?
no, I have not, and I still have a comment about it, even though I haven't heard of it before. You know, David Suzuki is perhaps the best-known scientist in Canada, among the best-known scientists in the world, and he was a gene jockey. He was a geneticist, and he realized midway through a career in genetics as an academic, he realized that he was contributing to a set of techniques that had the potential to destroy what we call life on Earth. And so he took the principled stance of opting out of that genetics field and became known as a more generalist environmentalist with his television shows and radio shows and so on. And I think he nailed it. I think he got it exactly right. Every time we come up with a solution, it creates more and more problems, and the problems are increasingly dire with every solution we come up with.
Right.
And that was his problem with genetic engineering, and I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. I go back to Barry Commoner.
Yes.
4 principles, one of them, nature knows best.
Exactly.
Stick with that.
And again, we're going back to the 60s and 70s, the American Cultural Revolution, and it was going on in the ecological/environmental world as well.
Yeah. I first read about the dangers of CO2, potential dangers of CO2 in 1977 or so. It was a book called Energy for Survival by Wilson Clark, subtitled An Alternative to Extinction.
Wow.
Appropriately.
Wow.
And he was a brilliant guy. It wasn't all that old when he wrote him. It was early 30s or something. And he was killed in a car crash not too long after that. My mind, I'm pretty paranoid. But in any event, it's a real tome of the book. It's still available online. You can use copies. Well worth it. And it laid out the very things we're seeing now. And it talked about, we overcome a lot of the technical difficulties with solar energy and wind power and some of the others. But he talks about it then. And he was referring to, I think, people that you referred to that were talking about it back in the 1800s. And then again in 1997 in Orion magazine was an article. And I had 5 predictions, which I now forget, that with climate change these would come about. And all 5 predictions came 100% true.
Wow.
Within the next 5 years. So that's
right. And perhaps in 1977 we did have a choice about extinction. Yeah. I think that we've been beyond that point, the point of having a choice as a society with respect to our extinction. I think we've been beyond that point probably since the 1970s. Mm-hmm. It might have been before that. It might have been when we harnessed the atom and decided we needed to start generating electricity that way. Maybe that was the time, which is the 1930s. In any event, I would argue that the millennials, for example, have little or nothing to do with this particular predicament we find ourselves in.
Right. Exactly.
That it predated them.
I just want to ask you a personal question on how, knowing all of this and getting, you're getting this word out very well. How do you function every day? I mean, it's depressing.
The same one.
That's a great question. I never really answered your previous question about how I got to this point. I just went down this road of my childhood and never really recovered. The Society for Conservation Biology didn't exist in the United States. It was founded in the United States in 1987. Well, that was the year I got my PhD. So I wasn't really a conservation biologist because there was no such thing when I got my PhD, for all practical purposes. I became a conservation biologist later when I was studying and working in the field, doing research on field biology, but somewhere deep within me, probably planted by my parents and my childhood, there was this love of the natural world. And the more I studied it, the more I realized that we were having untoward consequences, and that only made me love it more. So around and around I went, right? So now that I went down that path, I forgot your question, Sherry. Can you remind me?
How do you live with yourself?
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to stay positive. I mean, I've been covering since I started journalism. I started, that's how I met Dan. In fact, I interviewed him. I had a science and technology radio program in Utah. I had no idea that I was going to be covering research all over the country, mostly the West, about research just on the ground, just studies about particular species. And anyway, it's just all like the climate change. All of it was climate change starting then. And it's honestly hard for me to remain positive.
Of course. And there's several factors here. I've been dealing with this for a really long time, since I reached the conclusion in 2002. So to the extent that time heals all wounds, and it doesn't really at all, I have had time to at least come to grips with my own mortality. And that's important in a society that denies death. That we won't even admit that we're going to die. And so that's part of it. Another part of it is that I'm a conservation biologist, and I have been for a long time. I've been teaching speciation, extinction, and habitat for a really long time. And when you realize that habitat is everything in terms of the continued persistence of a species, and you realize that our habitat is going to go away because of the lack of potable water and the lack of healthy food and the lack of air to breathe with the meltdown of the world's nuclear power facilities and so on, when those things go away, then we're like any other animal to a great extent. Yeah, we have the big brains, we have the ability to emote, we have the ability to express these emotions, but ultimately we're animals, and as a consequence, our response to ecosystems and to the function of those ecosystems is going to be rooted in our animal nature. How could it not be? So that's part of it. And then the other part is because I enjoyed such enormous personal and professional privilege as a professor, most people don't even know what the PhD stands for. It's a doctor of philosophy.
Oh, I thought it was IND.
No, when you get it in range science, as I did, which is sort of the cowboy equivalent of forestry, which is what my undergraduate degree was in. When you get it in range science, the PhD stands for post-hole digger. I did a lot of that. In any event, when you're allowed the opportunity to read a lot and to come to grips with and develop your own personal philosophy, as I did as a professor, as I was expected to do as a professor, you're really paid to think. And so since I was paid to think, I read a lot of ancient philosophy. And that allowed me to develop a Camus-inspired sense of absurdism about the universe. And you know, that has helped a lot. So it's this combination of things: my love for the living planet, my observations that we've been destroying it far too long, and that you can't foul your own nest without getting a little poop on your feathers, and on and all these other factors that come into play. And I just think, how could we not? At this point, we're so far down this road of destroying every aspect of the living planet. How could we expect this to end well, no matter what we do at this point?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I've seen that since at least the 70s. But on a personal level, you know, I question sometimes the value of getting the word out to people who aren't going to listen when nothing can be done. And on top of that, with my relatively small handful of friends and colleagues, you might say, if we go down that road, there's immediate friction. I don't want to talk about it.
Yes.
I value their friendships.
Right.
And I got to say, I value their friendships more than my solitude and ideas.
Sure. And so I tell people all the time who approach me, and they say, when they bring it up with their friends immediately shut down. They don't become their friends anymore. People don't want to spend time with them, and blah, 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 and their family and so on. And so I tell them right up front, stop it. Just don't even mention it. That's my job. I've destroyed every relationship in my life already. You don't need to pick up the mantle on that one. Just point them my way. If they don't want to go my way, fine, just drop it. Leave them alone. Ignorance is bliss. This is my job, it's not yours. So let it go, because I've been doing this for a really long time and I haven't changed 3 minds.
Yeah.
And I'm paid to teach. Remember, I'm a professor. I'm supposed to be good at this. And to think that I mean, no offense, but to think that almost any Joe Sixpack could convince their buddies at the industrial job that that we're in the midst of abrupt climate change and we're all going to die. People are just going to laugh at him. He isn't even going to be invited to go out to beer anymore after work. Poor Joe.
I'd like to ask you a question about abrupt climate change and the symptoms that we're having now. Also because, you know, when I started in this career, scientists were predicting 20 years ago that, you know, 20 years, these things would be happening, such as tsunamis, hurricanes, and California wildfires, these massive wildfires, actually California and all over the world, which we don't hear as much about. And also I wonder if you see a correlation with these protests in France, the Yellow Vest protests in France happening about people, you know, upset about the economy there, and how that relates to this abrupt climate change.
Absolutely. All of the above can be attributed, at least in part, to abrupt climate change. We're seeing a refugee crisis that people foresaw 20 and 40 years ago. We're seeing, I don't know if you ever watched the television show, it was on HBO, it was called The Newsroom, and it was around for only 3 seasons, and I think the middle season was 2014.
Jeff Daniels, I think.
Yes, that's right. He was the anchor, and the writer was Aaron Sorkin, who wrote for The West Wing and Sports Night and apparently a few dozen other shows. I don't watch much television, and I never watched this entire episode, but there was a 4-minute clip that was all over YouTube, and I used to use it in some of my presentations. Jeff Daniels is interviewing this climate scientist from the federal government, who, and this is 2014, remember, and he's saying it's done, it's over, that humans are going extinct as a result of abrupt climate change. And he described wildfires too big for humans to control. He described basically rain bombs and floods and a refugee crisis and all the things we're seeing today. And, you know, if you look carefully back through the historical record, back through historical documents, you can find people predicting or projecting or guessing that those kinds of things would happen. And they all are. And so of course, when When you take a scorched earth policy to everything you do, you end up with a scorched earth, and we're there.
I do recall that, Charlie. I saw it twice, and I loved your response. You pointed out a few things which I don't remember, but he apparently neglected, the newscaster.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I thought it was very effective. But I want to touch on this. You often talk about do what you love. Well, I've done many things over my life, including living off the grid from 1983 till 97 in Idaho. But a lot of them are contingent on end goals that I'm not going to have time for, such as solar airships. I got some water touring. I got some writings. And, I just don't have enthusiasm because where's it going to go? So
Right.
Finding things that are meaningful when everything you've done and you could even argue that your teaching has, in a sense, no meaning because.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How can we think about a legacy when we're not going to have one? I mean, I think that's what your question is, right?
Sorry, we have a phone interruption there. my question was, how do you find things that you love or find meaningful, knowing that in a relatively short amount of time, it's not going to be. There's no point anyway.
Right.
In terms of,
Right. Yeah. So what's the point of trying to create a legacy when you know you don't have a legacy? What's the point of even thinking about your legacy when there's no such thing as a legacy for human beings anymore? That's a fair question, and one that I think about a lot. And in fact, it forms the basis for the workshop I developed with my partner, the Only Love Remains workshop. And, to think about your legacy, no matter how long you have, is to consider how you want to live today. So if you want your legacy to be a building, bricks and mortar, then it might not make much sense to invest your short time that you have in your life into making sure that bricks and mortar building happens that's going to have your name on it for all of eternity. And most of that eternity won't involve human beings. But on the other hand, if your legacy is in how you treat people and the human interactions that you have with humans and with the rest of the living planet, then that's a different situation. So so think about what it's going to say on your tombstone. Say there's humans around long enough that we each get a tombstone. What do you want it to say? Right? And so I had my students in my classes prepare, first of all, what they used to call an obituary. Now I think they call it a notification of death or something like that in the newspaper, right? And that's the long version. And then I would have them prepare what they want to have in their tombstone. And this is for courses called things like conservation biology and fire ecology and wildland vegetation management, because I think it's important to think about your legacy no matter what you're going to college to learn. And the shortest version of all that is what you put on your tombstone. If you want your tombstone to say, father, brother, wordsmith, then that tells me a lot about what you want to accomplish in your life and what you hold dear. That tells me a lot about your values and your principles. You value writing, you value being a father, you value being a brother. So live that way. So live as if those are the things that matter to you. And if, on the other hand, you're interested in bricks and mortar and you want your tombstone to say, God of capitalism, then maybe you're in the wrong field taking my class.
But my wife's former deceased husband, wanted on his tombstone, I told you I was sick.
You know, the desert anarchist Edward Abbey has a tombstone somewhere in the wilds of southwestern Arizona. I've never
Yeah.
seen it. I don't know where it is. I think it's in Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, and it says no comment.
Yeah, that's the kind of lines I'm thinking of. But okay, when you say only love remains, it's very difficult to love someone. Well, just for example, Donald Trump. You've been attacked obviously by many infinite people. It seems like, and I have to. It's very hard to. Well, the people who need the most love are the hardest ones to love. They say.
Yes.
I think there's some truth to that. And I have a hard time coming to grips with, really giving a damn about certain people.
Right. Yeah, so how can I even say those words at the edge of extinction? Only love remains.
Exactly.
That's a fine question, and for me at least, the love is manifest in various ways. Love for the living planet, and let's keep in mind that Donald Trump is symptomatic of what's going on in the United States and perhaps the world, and he is almost certain to inherit an ice-free Arctic. He didn't create it.
Right.
He was elected. He was the guy who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that doesn't make me like him any better. I think that he is the worst president in my lifetime, and I've thought that about every president in my lifetime so far. Apparently, they're not getting any better.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it is symptomatic of the whole decline of society, whatever we call civilization. Yeah, I see that pretty clearly, and I get quite unhappy with people who, anybody but Trump.
right,
That mentality. It's like, give me a break. We created him, and you could very well argue that Hillary Clinton created him. I think that's
sure,
a very solid case. But,
right, absolutely. And there's a lot of things to not love. And trust me, I've encountered most of those people since I started speaking and going on tour about abrupt climate change leading to near-term human extinction. There's a lot of people who I could hate. There are a lot of people who have betrayed me throughout my life, and
Right.
and I have, maybe my love doesn't apply to them, but that still leaves approximately 7.5 billion people who, to my knowledge, don't hate me yet.
It sounds like you had a pretty good circle of friends and beliefs there.
Yes, absolutely. And I have a wonderful and loving partner. I have this incredibly privileged life. I've managed to go almost 10 years without drawing an income of any kind. And yet I've still got a roof over my head, and I'm eating apparently way too much every day to look at my body fat. And, I've had this life of enormous privilege, and it's going to end shorter than it, quote, should, according to the actuary who prepares life insurance documents. But so what? I've still had a lot longer run than a whole bunch of people who were really famous historically. And so if I can't get something accomplished in my 58 years, then I got nothing to complain about. Is my view on the whole situation.
Yeah.
I've had a good run in at a time in a place of enormous privilege. How can I complain about any of that? Even if it had been half as long as it is, it still would have been a good run.
Yes. Yeah, my greatest heartache is for the younger generation.
Absolutely.
Like I said, I was born in '47, so kids I taught are well into their 50s by now, many of them anyway. And I have one son, a biological son, kind of a strange circumstance there, but I feel really badly for him and his son, my grandson. Fortunately, I don't get to see, but these are people who are totally innocent of anything,
Absolutely.
And,
Absolutely. And I mean, that's a great point. These are people who were born into this set of circumstances by and birthed by people who were completely ignorant about where we were headed. It's not their fault. And so I see a lot of shaming and a lot of blaming, particularly by climate scientists, by the way. And
I like your take on James Hansen, the young people's burden. You put it well.
thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the young people who created this mess. It's the generation of James Hansen and me, and I think Hansen is approximately a generation older than I am. But it's the so-called greatest generation than the baby boomers who got us into this mess to a very great extent. And so to push it, to pawn it off on future generations, listen, we created this mess and you're going to have to clean it up, that's just completely irresponsible. At the very least, let's own it. Let's own up to the fact that we made the mess and that it's irrecoverable, that we are not going to clean up the mess because we don't have time. And so maybe the best we can say is, I'm sorry.
I have just a question here, just because for timing, I've got to get going in about 5-10 minutes, and just because of my experience with public radio, people love to hear a positive message and end with something constructive that can be done. And so I'm wondering if what you can suggest to people listening to this, what they can do on a daily basis, or to help somehow make a difference, at least in their own local world, or even that could affect the global world. And what can you tell people, or what message do you send on how to live in this really new world and the uncertain future?
Yeah, well, it is an uncertain future, and that's key here. I don't know your expiration date, and neither do you, unless you have a shotgun handy or a bottle of pills, right? So, because we don't know your expiration date, I encourage people to live with urgency, to live with love, to do what they love. Because life is short, no matter how you look at it, life is going to be short. Life is going to be short for Dan. Life is going to be short for me. Life is going to be short for people half my age, 29 years old. Life is going to be short for people who are in their teens right now. What do you want to do? What do you want to focus on? I want people to do what they love, not what their parents want them to do. Not what the culture screams at them to do, but what they actually love. Do what you love, do it well. Why would you not? If you know you're only going to live for another month, another year, another decade, would you not pursue doing what you wanted to do instead of adhering to what the culture, what the society tells you to do instead? I think that doesn't make any sense. For me, that doesn't make any sense. The culture tells you to work a 40-hour week every single week and take 2 weeks off every year for vacation and put your nose to the grindstone, and even if it means doing a job you hate, because when you're 65 you're going to get to retire from that and then you can start living well. Forget that. Let's start living well now, today, right here, right now. This is what we have.
Yeah. It makes great sense. I have one more topic that you often talk about, civilization being a heat engine. I think pretty much any damn fool looking around as they go through their day sees we are indeed a heat engine, running on fossil fuels. But I've looked a fair amount at solar power. I looked off the grid, like I said, so I was looking on solar panels. I built a number of windmills, and I've done a lot of reading on their net energy output or loss, as the case may be. And it appears that nuclear power has a net energy loss pretty significantly, based on, say, Amy Robbins' Rocky Mountain Institute. And yet solar panels and windmills and maybe wave machines actually do put out, over the course of their lifetime, a lot more energy than it takes to produce them.
Right.
That being the case, wouldn't it theoretically be possible to have a civilization that is not a heat engine?
You know, maybe. It could very well be. You have to look at the life cycle of solar panels and see what kinds of materials go into them.
Exactly.
You know, there's a lot of
Yeah.
rare earths that go into
Right.
solar panels, for example, and they're called rare
Yeah.
earths for a reason.
But they
And
are getting more organic as well.
right,
That's
absolutely. So it could be, I don't know. You know, that work is based primarily on Tim Garrett's publications, which
right.
number at least 3 now, and they're based on the laws of thermodynamics. Is there an out? Is there an escape clause in there somewhere? There could very well be. He's the guy to talk to about it, not me. He's the civilization as a heat engine guy.
Yeah, I did have lunch with him about 2 or 3 months ago, and I asked him specifically about that, and maybe it's my own obtuseness, but I didn't really get an answer I could sink my teeth into.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm asking you.
Well,
Point of view.
you know, he's an atmospheric scientist, and he knows more about physics than I will ever know. And so it could be a translation problem.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. But in any event, even if civilization is not a heat engine, you look around at what industrial civilization is doing to the planet, and you can't conclude that it's all good. And I lived off grid for about 10 years myself in New Mexico and western Belize. And so, you know, I viewed myself as doing the right thing, living off grid and growing an orchard and growing my own food and so on. And
Very impressive.
and it still is an unmitigated disaster when you look at the outcomes for the planet.
Mm-hmm. Yes. When I lived off the grid and really looked at some of the materials, as for example, the double pane thermal glass, the solar panels themselves, I got a deal on some used phone company batteries. Each one weighed about 350 pounds of solid lead, sulfuric acid.
Right.
You know, I think this is hardly a sustainable outfit here, you know. So, yeah, definitely see that. I remember some years ago there was an interview with Jane Goodall, and someone said to her, the interviewer said to her, "Do you think that chimps are smarter than we are?" And she said, "Well, they've been around for many thousands of years without destroying their environment."
Mm-hmm.
So,
You know, I like what Daniel Quinn said and wrote when asked about everybody moving off grid and breaking new ground and so on. He replied, "Haven't we broken enough ground already?"
yeah.
And he had this wonderful perspective that most of us lack in terms of being able to view society through a certain lens. And I've come to appreciate him more and more.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question real quick. We actually have to get, unfortunately, sign off here soon. Got to go out of town to take care of family. But just in an effort of kind of making a 1 hour piece that is a circle and a conclusion. And I know a lot of people have this question. I do. You know, where are the best places to live in the face of climate change and more environmental disasters? And do you have an opinion on, where to live in terms of surviving the longest, I guess?
Okay, so there's a couple of questions there. Where to live and where to live so that you live longest. And I used to think that the further south you got on the globe, the better you would be, as long as you didn't get to Antarctica. And when I first started talking about abrupt climate change leading to near-term human extinction, in fact, the month after I gave my first presentation, November 2012, and it was recorded and put on YouTube, the following month, Steve Wozniak contacted me, the guy who single-handedly created the Apple I and Apple II computers, one of the 3 founders of Apple. And he told me that because of my message, he was moving to the southern hemisphere, and it took him 2 years to get there. He now lives in the southern island state of Tasmania, the southern state of Australia. And I believe then that that would be a good idea. But then, after that, we came to understand the full impact of the aerosol masking effect. And now I don't think it matters. In terms of longevity, I don't think anybody gets a whole lot longer than anybody else. I think living in cities like where I do now will be kind of an ugly scene when the water stops coming through the taps and the food doesn't show up at the grocery stores anymore. Beyond that, I don't think there will be habitat for humans more than a few months longer in any one place than in any other place, again, because of the profound impact of the aerosol masking effect. And so my message when people ask me where they ought to go in light of abrupt climate change, I point at my heart and I tell them to go right here. I tell them to live here now, and if they can find a tribe, if they can find people they love, live with them fully, with gratitude.
And one quick similar comment. Back in the 70s, I was seriously looking at moving to New Zealand, thinking that when Reagan set off the nuclear war, that might be the safer place. It never happened. They wanted certain skills and whatever. It didn't work out. But not like within months after that, seriously looking into that, they were about to start a nuclear war, drop a nuclear bomb or two in the Falkland Islands. Okay, man. There's one pale blue dot. That's all we've got.
Right. Talk about out of the frying pan into the fire.
Bloom wherever you are.
Yeah.
I guess.
Well, I feel torn because I have a job in Northern California, but I'm currently my family's been in Salt Lake, and I'm currently here now, and torn between where I'm going to stay here and I go back to Northern California. When I think about it, that way, Northern California, the tick problem is getting out of control, and tick-borne diseases, which is also a symptom of a side effect of climate change. And then in Utah, it's air pollution. And so it's
well, we're sitting on a major fault that is long overdue. Last I read just the other day is they're predicting 50 to 100 years now. But major, the Wasatch Mountains are a big fault block. And then short distance away, you've got Yellowstone, the big cauldron there bubbling away. And nobody's quite sure what that's going to do.
So it makes a lot of sense what you say,
As Homer wrote in the Iliad some 2,800 years ago, any moment may be your last.
Yeah.
And he did not follow that up with, therefore you should run around screaming, the world is going to end, the world is going to end. That wasn't the point at all.
Yeah. I really like your idea of stay calm. There's nothing else you can do anyway. That has actually helped me quite a bit in getting through the stages of grief that Kubler-Ross laid out. I think I'm pretty well into the acceptance stage. I still wake up sometimes, freak out in the morning. Who doesn't, I guess.
Right.
Well, I guess Sherry's got to go, and maybe we'll get back another time.
Yeah, I would love to continue the conversation, if that's okay with you, and some more specific questions, because I think this will be more than one part.
Right.
And we just scratched the surface, definitely.
Right. No, that's great. Sherry, Dan, I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today and look forward to it anytime.
Oh, thank you. And I really appreciate it. And I appreciate that Dan introduced me to your work. And
I'm sure there's plenty of blame to go around. It's not just Dan's fault.
By the way, I put a number of your interviews on opednews.com. You get very positive feedback.
Oh, good.
And people were really interested. They're generally above the crowd, you might say.
And I'll do some editing when I put this together. So it flows as a 1 hour piece, and then we'll probably we'll love to follow up with another, like a series of pieces, actually.
That sounds great.
And we'll keep you posted on that. And thank you very much to Pauline for doing the technical side of this. And
right. Thank you both.
Thanks, you both. Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care.
Have a wonderful day.
Thanks. You too.